Thank you, Ann Betteridge, and thank you all for coming out on this beautiful Friday afternoon. This is now my fourth time giving a talk in the CMES and MENAS Friday afternoon lecture series. So I want to thank Ann Betteridge for inviting me out all of these times, to thank many of you who've been out, have attended my previous talks, which are in essence culminating today. The talks that I've given previously over the years were bits and pieces of works and chapters and sections that ended up in my book, and a lot of the questions and comments I received in this very room in previous years have helped improve the book and make the arguments stronger and the examples clearer. So it's quite fitting too that my first book talk, since the book has been published, would also be in this room. So thank you again to CMES and to MENAS for all of your support. So what I want to do today is talk about the major findings and arguments of my book, but as I do so, I also want to tell you a little bit also about the process that went into formulating and finding and writing the book itself. It is an outgrowth of my dissertation that I wrote at the University of Chicago 10 plus years ago. So it has developed quite a bit since then. I've added additional findings and arguments and insights that have also transformed the dissertation into a book. The process turned out to be a lot more laborious and time-consuming than I initially thought, but rewarding as well. So let's start with the overall framework and arguments of the book. So one of the things that I do in this book, and as you can tell from the subtitle, Palestinian Citizens of Israel and the Arab World. So one of the things that I really focus on in this work is adopting a transnational scope for analyzing this particular group of Palestinians. My focus is on history, intellectual history, cultural history. And as I sort of discovered or became interested in this particular subject matter, in this particular community, and started reading the secondary literature about them, I found that most of the works that had been done on them were done in the fields of sociology, political science, anthropology. At the time, and sort of early on in my dissertation, very little historical work was done about them, very little work that analyzes their own perspectives, utilizing their own writings or their own subjectivity was going on. And so initially, I was very interested in just finding out what they themselves thought about themselves, rather than looking at them as objects in a larger field of analysis. So my dissertation was very much focused on their writings, which I'll talk about in a moment. But as I was doing so, and as I was focused on their writings, I became fascinated by the fact that they were very engaged and very attuned to debates and discussions that were happening throughout the Arab world. And this is in the 1950s and 60s, at a time when they were physically cut off from the rest of the region, when they weren't allowed to travel to the Arab world, Arabs weren't allowed to come into Israel, both as a result of Israeli travel restrictions, but also as a result of the Arab League boycott on Israel that extended to its Palestinian citizens. So the transnational aspect, I brought it out more clearly in the process of the book, moving beyond the nation state as a unit of analysis, or as the primary mode of analysis. And in doing so, I also refuted the prevailing theory of the scholars at the time, and arguably to this day, that this group of people was largely, because they were physically isolated and cut off from the rest of the region, that they were also intellectually, politically, culturally unengaged as well. And as I hope to show today, and as my book demonstrates, that's not at all the case. They were very much engaged in regional debates and discussions. A second framework that I adopt that was an outgrowth of the first, is really focusing on the centrality of text, of textual production, and related to that, the worldliness of text. And this concept of worldliness is one that I take from Edward Said, who wrote about the worldliness of text and stressed the importance of focusing on the social, cultural, and historical context in which texts were produced. So in contrast to, and perhaps pushing back against approaches or methodologies that will focus on the text in and of themselves, Said was calling upon scholars to really pay attention to the conditions of production. And that's related to another theory, another argument laid out by Raymond Williams, who also calls upon scholars to focus on the means of production that go into a text. So focusing on the material conditions, on the backgrounds of the authors, on the circumstances in which they were produced, on the economic conditions in which they were produced. And also, I sort of built on that by also focusing not just on the material background of the production or of the authors, but also the circulation. So why and how was it that Palestinian intellectuals inside Israel are getting access to Lebanese cultural journals or Egyptian newspapers or following debates that are happening in Iraq, for example? So as I was coming across these things in my primary research, I became very interested, A, in figuring out how and why this happened, and then B, using it to understand more fully what are some of the larger implications of this, looking at it in a transnational scope. Oops. So looking at both the production and circulation. The other thing that I noticed when I looked at the existing scholarship about the group, about Palestinian citizens of Israel, is that they tended to focus on them as a subaltern category, as a group of either sort of marginalized or rural or backwards peasants who were uplifted by the state in the sort of earlier generation of scholarship, and then starting in the late 70s, early 80s, focusing on this group as a marginalized one that was disempowered by Israel, marginalized from the state, discriminated against, etc., but still focused on the state itself and focused on the community as one that was largely urban, one that was largely rural, uneducated, illiterate, and so forth. And while literacy rates overall were low, I was again struck by the very vibrant intellectual life that I was coming across in these texts. And so looking at Palestinian citizens of Israel, not just as a marginalized community, a rural community, a subaltern community, but also one that had a small yet vibrant community of intellectuals that were again very engaged, very political and very politicized. Gramsci's concept of organic intellectuals comes through very clearly, and they themselves saw themselves, they didn't use the term organic intellectuals, but they referred to themselves as muthaqafun, as intellectuals, and they very much saw themselves and were very explicit about the importance of intellectuals connecting to the society in which they lived, helping the society in which they lived, and challenging the structures of power that they faced. So Gramsci's notion of organic intellectuals came into being very much. And then because I adopted a larger time frame than we sometimes see, especially in dissertations that tend to focus on just a few years, my initial dissertation focused on the years 1948 to 1967, so a 19-year period. My book extends even further to the pre-48 period and goes on to about 1971. And in that larger time frame, I was also able to examine changes that could be seen across generation. So there were very vibrant debates happening among and between individual intellectuals, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But there were also these very clear generational shifts that happened between intellectuals who grew up in the Mandate period and were fully fledged adults, and by the time 1948 comes, versus those who were children in 1948 who were raised in the Israeli state system. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that later. And here, David Scott's notion of generations as social units was very helpful. And he, of course, is building on Karl Mannheim, sociologist Karl Mannheim's concept of generations as social units. And I think that's also another fruitful way to think about some of these intellectual discussions that take place. And then finally, another key framework and argument that I make in the book is that when we look at these texts and when we examine these intellectuals, we really see that they were engaged in global discourses of decolonization. And it might strike some people as strange that they would think of themselves, or that we would treat them, as being engaged or part of a decolonizing movement, because of course they were, after all, citizens of a self-proclaimed post-colonial state, Israel, that itself sort of removed the shackles of British colonial power. And so why is it that I would refer to them as engaged in decolonizing discourses? And the answer to that stems from and builds upon more recent work, particularly by historian Shira Robinson, who argues that when we think of settler colonial systems and liberal democratic systems, we often think of them as being mutually exclusive. But she makes the case, I think very persuasively and forcefully, that in the case of Israel in its first 2 decades, they're really an amalgamation or a combination of both. In other words, Israel has elements of a liberal democratic state, but it also shares elements of settler colonialism that a lot of other colonial powers have. And so she coins this term liberal settler state. And so if, as I think she is correct in arguing that Israel in the 1950s and 60s can be considered to be a liberal settler state with elements of colonialism in it, particularly in terms of their treatment of the Palestinian minority, then it would make sense to look at the other side of that coin, that Palestinian intellectuals living in that moment likewise see themselves as engaged in a form of anti-colonialism. And that helped me make sense of the fact that these Palestinian intellectuals were so deeply engaged and invested in anti-colonial movements of the region and around the world during this time period. But of course, they were not calling for outright national independence. They weren't calling for secession. They weren't calling for a Palestinian state within Israel. They were still running in elections, running for Knesset, voting, etc. And here is where another framework also I think is very useful and something that I build on, and that's the work of Gary Wilder, who in looking at the intellectual production of Negritude co-founders Amy Cesar and Leopold Senger, he argues too, and I build upon this in my work, that we need to broaden our understanding of decolonization to move beyond just the idea of national liberation as the political goal of all decolonizing discourses. And that there is space, and we should allow for intellectual space to hold that one can engage in anti-colonial discourses and decolonizing movements without necessarily calling for outright secession, rebellion, and the establishment of an independent nation state. And that's very much what the intellectuals I study were arguing for. They were arguing and making legible their own conditions through the lens of colonialism and anti-colonialism, while at the same time engaging in and pushing for greater rights within the liberal aspect of the liberal settler state that Robinson argues for. So those are the overall frameworks. That's the scholarship that I built my work around. Let me go into a little more detail about what I found. So very briefly, who are the Palestinian citizens of Israel? They are the pre-1948 period. They were indistinguishable from the rest of the Palestinian Arab community. So these are the Arabs who were living in Mandate Palestine. And they were very much engaged with what was happening in the Arab East more broadly. Many of them traveled to what we would now call Lebanon and Syria, in particular in Egypt, for school, for work, for political activity. The British exiled a number of communists, Palestinian communist activists, to Iraq in the 1930s, late 1930s. So Iraq plays a very interesting role in this history as well. So they were very much engaged with and part of the larger Arab East. Then the 1948 war happens, the Israeli War of Independence, the Palestinian Nakba, and by the time all the armistice treaties are signed by 1949, there remain about 160,000 Palestinian Arabs within the Green Line, within the area that is recognized as the Israeli state. That includes the area that was allocated as part of the Jewish state by the UN, and the additional areas in the Galilee and south as well that Israel conquered over the course of the summer of 1948, where the bulk of Palestinians ended up being, so in the Galilee primarily. Most of them were granted citizenship by 1952. And again, Shira Robinson gives a very fascinating story about how that happened, and how that happened despite the wishes of Israeli leadership and not because of it. There remained a small minority that continued to not have citizenship. They were referred to as, euphemistically, as present absentees or as internal refugees who were not granted citizenship, but the vast majority of them were. Yet throughout this period, even though they were granted citizenship, they were still subject, that is, Palestinian citizens of Israel were subject to a different set of laws than Jewish Israeli citizens were. They were subject to a military government. military generals would be granted governor status of different areas where there were large concentrations of Arabs, of Arab villages and towns, and even of neighborhoods where some of the Arabs lived within larger cities, within Haifa, for example, or Acre. Part of and one of the most onerous aspects of the military regime, of military government, was what became known as a sort of pass regime. Papers, documents became very important because they were what allowed, or did not allow, Palestinian citizens to be able to travel, to work, to go anywhere that they wanted to. So the picture that you see there is a woman showing Israeli police officers, or military personnel, her travel papers, showing that she has a right to be on the road going from point A to point B. Those passes and permits were distributed and managed in a very ad hoc system at first. Over the course of the 1950s, it became more systematized. By the late 1950s, some of that pass regime had eased up if you were not politically active. If you were politically active, or if you were part of this cohort of these organic intellectuals, muthaqafun, or activists or writers who pushed back against Israeli state narratives, then you were subject to, and many of them were subject to, more onerous regimes and restrictions on their movement. Town arrest, house arrest, nighttime curfews, and so on. And they really want to shut down. Okay. And then lastly, as I mentioned already, they were largely physically and politically cut off from the Arab world. So those are the people I'm talking about. I initially wanted to call the book Resisting Isolation. My editor nixed that idea. But I still like that idea as a concept for understanding how the book is laid out and the main arguments that I make. And so one of the things that really shapes and helps give structure to the book itself are what I call these 8 strategies of resistance, or of resisting isolation. And there's a lot of overlap between them, as you'll see, and they're kind of chronological, but not exactly. And I'll briefly talk a little bit about them. So the first strategy, especially in in those initial few years when there was a lot of fear, there was a lot of trepidation, there was also a lot of uncertainty. Would they be granted citizenship? What would their future hold? Was there going to be another war, etc.? So there's a deep sense of besiegement among a lot of Palestinians in those first 5 years or so. And for reasons that I won't go into now, but I'll be happy to talk about in the Q&A, for a variety of reasons, the Communist Party of Israel ended up becoming at the forefront of political activism in Israel, in those early years in particular. Partly because it was the only legal non-Zionist political party that was allowed to function, that could run politicians and have Knesset members, and etc. Some of it having to do with Cold War politics, and some of it having to do with pre-48 history. So the Communist Party, Arab members, Palestinian Arab members of the Communist Party, were very adamant about the idea of trying to bring people together, just physically bringing people together. And it was no small feat early on. They were very, as I mentioned before, you had roadblocks and past regime issues and so forth. The communists, though, were also very keen on not just bringing Palestinian citizens together, but they very much put at the forefront of their political and cultural program having Arab-Jewish gatherings, Arabs and Jews together for cultural festivals, for political protests, for other types of gatherings. And it stemmed from their belief, from the Communist Party ideologues' main belief, that if enough Israeli Jews come to recognize that Palestinian citizens ought to be treated equally and that they should unite on a class basis, on an internationalist basis, then the Zionist regime would crumble, or would at least be hindered in their quest to continue the marginalization of Palestinians. And in this, they also were, the Jewish communist members, also many of them shared this belief. So there was a great deal of emphasis on joint Jewish-Arab, as I said, literary festivals, gatherings, etc. They sort of fall off the radar a little bit in the 1950s, and by 1956, especially with the Suez Crisis, we don't really see many of them happening anymore. But early on, it became a very key organizing principle. What we also see early on is the utilization of local Arabic newspapers and journals, particularly the communist ones, which I think I had a picture of these two, Al-Ittihad and Al-Jadid. Al-Ittihad was the newspaper, the Arabic newspaper, official paper of the Communist Party, and Al-Jadid was its monthly cultural journal. So utilizing those Arabic newspapers and journals to acquaint readers and listeners, because things were read out loud, so acquainting their audience members with some of the broader decolonizing discourses from a very communist perspective, of course, but also translating world literature. So I found a lot of translated into Arabic poems of Pablo Neruda, Lorca, Nazim Hikmet, short stories by Mayakovsky, a lot of the Russian and Soviet writers, but other global writers as well. And they utilize these local Arabic newspapers and journals to push back against what I call Israeli colonial narratives about the Palestinians in general and Palestinian citizens of Israel in particular. Specifically the idea that the Israeli state was a modernizing force for good, for uplift of the Palestinian community. These authors and these writers in the communist papers and newspapers were saying, no, we don't need the Israeli state to uplift us. We have a very robust and vibrant Arab civilization, thank you very much. That what we need, in fact, is equal treatment, equal rights, not sort of paternalistic policies on the part of the Israeli government. So I mentioned already that the communists were the main party that was active in those early years. After 1956, with the Suez Crisis, and as Arab nationalism becomes a more robust and exciting dynamic in the Arab region, that Arab nationalism makes its way into the Palestinian intellectual circles in Israel as well. And the communists start to be challenged by more overt Arab nationalists, pan-Arab nationalist intellectuals, who criticize the communists for not being nationalist enough, for putting too much weight or too much trust in the idea that Israel will just be made to be convinced to treat them equally. And so there starts to be, at first, nonpartisan organizations that bring communists and non-communists together. By the late 1950s, those nonpartisan groups become more partisan, and we start to see rival organizations where the communists continue but are being challenged more vociferously by Palestinians who sort of stake their claim more clearly in an Arab nationalist worldview. Another thing that I found, and I wish I had more detail about this, but people were very reluctant to share with me the details of this. But I found a lot of evidence of the smuggling of texts across the border. Either Arab regional texts being smuggled into Israel, because remember, again, there was a boycott, you weren't supposed to do that. Yet there were all these articles and poems and things that were copied verbatim from Al-Adab, Al-Adib, from Iraqi journals and so forth. No one wants to tell me how that happened, but it happened. And then later on in the 1960s, we start to see smuggling going in the opposite direction. And I'll talk about how that and why that happened a little bit later. Another thing, a theme, or another strategy that I found was an emphasis on poetry. And this was something that I talked a lot about in my dissertation, less so in the book. But poetry became a very popular means by which Palestinian intellectuals and aspiring intellectuals could challenge state narratives, state policies, and affirm their connection to other Palestinians, to other Arabs, and to the decolonizing world. So a lot of tributes, for example, to Africa and to Lumumba, to Egypt and to Iraq, and to other Palestinians as well. And those would get composed, they would be published often in those newspapers and journals. So they had a shelf life that was longer than just an oral recitation of it. But oral recitation was also an important aspect to this through poetry festivals and other similar types of gatherings. A few intellectuals were also able to attend international conferences, usually in Europe. They tended to be members of the Communist Party who had permission to be able to go to international festivals, and some from the leftist Zionist Mapam party as well. These had marginal utility, I would argue, in the overall schema of these strategies, but I think they did play an important role. And then later on, in the mid to late 1960s, and as we get into the 1970s, we start to see more of the last two strategies of sending memoranda to the international community. The Arab nationalist Arid movement very famously sent a memorandum in 1964 to the UN and to the Arab League, to all sorts of other international bodies, laying out in detail the discrimination that their community faced at the hands of the Israeli government. And then after 1967, we start to see a number of Palestinian intellectuals who go into exile. In some cases, like Mahmoud Darwish, it was sort of voluntary, I say sort of with a grain of salt. And then others were banished. Members of the Ard movement, for example, were banished outright. Sabri Jirius and Habib Qahoji were just exiled without asking their permission. But what happens as a result is, because they move to the regional Arab capitals, they're able to bring with them their inside knowledge and experiences of being Palestinian citizens of Israel, and are able to share them with those who had no idea about it. And so it ends up changing the dynamic in very interesting ways. So those are the overall strategies of resisting isolation, and I will postpone again here. I've mentioned already some of the decolonizing discourses. So you have here Gamal Abdel Nasser, his speech nationalizing the Suez Canal in July 1956. The top middle picture is people celebrating in Iraq, the Iraqi Revolution, the overthrow of the Hashemite government in 1958. On the right there, you see Patrice Lumumba on the day of Congo's formal independence. That's him after he had just given his Independence Day speech, which again was not something that I would have expected to see a lot of interest in among Palestinian citizens of Israel, but it speaks to these larger decolonizing dynamics that I'm talking about. And then at the bottom there you have the Algerian independence celebrations in 1962. And I include these four pictures because all four of them were very much talked about and celebrated among the Palestinian intellectuals in Israel itself, because they saw them as kindred spirits in a way, for different reasons and at different levels. But the attempts, the anti-colonial and successful anti-colonial movements helped Palestinian intellectuals make legible their own conditions. And as I said, even though they themselves were not advocating for full-on national independence or secession, this idea of a decolonizing discourse is something that they very much took part in. So in terms of the intellectuals and the generational differences, I wanted to briefly talk about two such intellectuals who make a prominent appearance in my book. The first that you see with the white hair is Emil Habibi. He was born in 1921, died in 1996. And the other is Mahmoud Darwish, the younger fellow there, who was born in 1942 and died in 2008. Now, both these intellectuals are primarily known in the international community for their literary skills. Emil Habibi wrote a famous novel, The Secret Life of Saeed the Optimist. Mahmoud Darwish's poetry is well known. So, but they also represent this generational divide that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. Emil Habibi grew up in Haifa in the Mandate period. He was very much influenced by the Palestine Communist Party, the pre-1948 Communist Party. And he also worked in the early 1940s for the Palestine Broadcast Service, the radio station, the main radio station of the time. And it was at that radio station that he got to meet a lot of regional intellectuals who would do sort of book tours and radio tours. So they would do these tours where they would go through Beirut and Jerusalem and Cairo and Damascus and Baghdad and do these kind of regional tour circuits. So Habibi got to meet a lot of people through working at the radio station. And he also was an avid reader of a newspaper or a journal that was published in Beirut called At-Tariq. that was sort of leftist in orientation, but not exclusively communist. And through At-Tariq, Habibi became very much acquainted with many of the key Arab intellectual, political, literary debates of the time, between leftists like Maroun Aboud and more liberal modernists like Taha Hussein and Al-Aqad. So when 1948 happens, he's briefly exiled to Beirut, Habibi that is, but manages to return across the Lebanese-Israeli border and reestablishes himself. He was a communist activist before 1948, reestablishes himself after 1948 as a Communist Party leader, is eventually elected to the Knesset, where his position in the Knesset gives him sort of diplomatic immunity and cover that allows him to be a little bit more forthright in some of his political writings and so forth. He was also the longtime editor-in-chief of Al-Ittihad, the Arabic newspaper, and he wrote many of the newspaper's editorials. So that was his writing and his pen. So he essentially was a spokesman for the Communist Party, especially in those early years. As a result, he took a dim view of the Arab nationalists that were rising up in the late 1950s and 1960s. And in some of in interviews I did with intellectuals who were active at the time, there was a clear generational gap whereby the younger intellectuals could see the appeal of Arab nationalism even if they were technically Communist Party members, but the old guard, Habibi foremost among them, had no room in his sort of intellectual or political agenda for any of that. So that is Amir Habibi. Mahmoud Darwish was born, as it says, in 1942. So he was a child. He was about 6 or 7 years old in 1948. He too fled with his family to Beirut and eventually snuck back across the border a couple of years later. This put Darwish and his family in that minority that I told you about earlier, Palestinians who did not receive citizenship in 1952. So he grew up being an internal refugee, a present absentee. And his family lived in constant fear of expulsion. And today, with a lot of the situation with DACA and other things, the parallels are quite striking. So he describes, for example, how when he was in second grade in elementary school, his school principal had to hide him in a closet whenever the school inspector from the education ministry came by, because they were checking documented status, right? So he had to hide him in a closet because he was afraid that if the young Darwish was caught, he and his family would be expelled back to Lebanon. As a result, Darwish felt more out of place in Israel than in Lebanon because, as he wrote, there is no logic to making someone a refugee in his own country. Darwish's literary skills were seen early on, and so in 8th grade he was asked to recite a poem at his school in celebration of Israeli Independence Day. And he later explained in an interview that he gave a very kind of naive, simplistic, sort of 8th grade type poem that was a cry out from an Arab child to a Jewish child, in which he remembers something along the lines of, "You have a house, I have no house because I am a refugee. You have holidays and celebrations, I have no holiday or celebration. Can't we play together?" So after reciting this poem at the Israeli Independence Day celebration, not realizing he had done anything wrong, Darwish was promptly summoned to the local military governor, who threatened to revoke his father's work permit. His father worked in a quarry, if Darwish continued to recite such poems. Darwish got the message, and for the next several years he wrote nothing but romantic poetry, love poetry, and so forth. But he had no idea and couldn't really wrap his head around the idea that an 8th grader could be conceived of as a threat to the state. However, he also credits his reading of Al-Ittihad and Al-Jadid for, quote, igniting within me a desire to connect with reality. Poetry festivals that he attended likewise imbued in him the idea that poetry could serve a political function. And as they say, the rest is history. He became a world-famous poet, becoming famous with his poem Identity Card, also known as Record I Am an Arab, which I can recite later on. So Darwish grew up within the Israeli state, so he was much more forceful, and he becomes much more of a forceful critic of the Israeli state and of its discriminatory policies. And he also later on becomes much more Palestinian, like actual sort of articulating a Palestinian identity as opposed to an Arab identity or a communist identity or an Israeli identity. And that was very much reflective of the generation in which he grew up, and also the connections that he made with other Palestinian intellectuals. So one of the things that I didn't notice when I was writing my dissertation, or didn't notice very clearly, but came out as I did more research for the book, was the incredible role that Palestinian intellectuals in exile played in alerting the Arab world to what was going on inside the Green Line. Before I talk about them, I should mention that I looked long and hard for Arabic writings in the region that made mention of Palestinian citizens of Israel. And before 1967, I found very little. And the little I did find tended to be very either condescending towards them or very kind of nasty, actually. That they betrayed their country, they betrayed their cause by voluntarily staying in the regime of the Zionist entity. And that had they been true Palestinians, they would have left and joined, in solidarity, I suppose, their fellow Palestinian refugees. I found a few exceptions to that narrative, and the few exceptions I found all turned out to be Palestinian intellectuals who were all of different generations. Faisal is a bit older than the other two, but had a much more nuanced appraisal of what Palestinian citizens of Israel, what their conditions were like, and what their political orientation should be. So the first mention I see of this that would have been published in sort of the region was by Palestinian intellectual Faisal, who writes a report for the Arab League in 1955 about the Palestinians, what he calls the Palestinians under oppression. And he lays out the forms of discrimination they face, the destruction of mosques and churches, the internal displacements, and so forth. Then I don't see too much else for a number of years. The next mention I see is in 1961, when Ahmed Sidqi Dajani gives a lecture in Libya, which is where he was living, to a group of Arab intellectuals about the condition of Palestinians in Israel. Again, focusing on the discrimination and the oppression that they face, also giving hints, though, at some of their resistance. Now, I should mention in full disclosure that Ahmed Sidqi Dajani is my uncle. He's a historian, an academic historian. He's also my uncle. And so when I told him about my dissertation topic many years ago, he said, "Oh, I gave a speech on that. You should read it." So I did. And I noticed that his sources were only English language sources. There were two books that had come out in the UK in 1915 and 1960, one by a journalist and one by an academic, that talked about the condition of Palestinians. And so he drew on that. He didn't seem to have been aware of Fayyasal's earlier Arab League report. And it, again, goes to show how little information there was in the Arab world about this particular group of people. Both Faisal and Dajani were really focused, though, on making more of a point about Israeli oppression of the Palestinians than they were about the Palestinians in and of themselves. The first sort of sign that something changes is really with Ghassan Kanafani, who in 1965-66 is for the first time talking about the poetry and the cultural resistance that he finds among these groups. And so he writes an article, that's a front page article in Al-Adab, prominent Beirut-based literary journal, and he writes a book around the same time where, again, he mentions very obliquely in his introduction how he's gotten access to articles and issues of Ittihad Jadid, but he's not going to tell you how. And when I tried to follow this up with interviews, people would sort of mumble things and say, "Turn off the recorder. Don't write that down." So things were being snuck across the border, but again, we don't know how. But Kanafani was the first one to really say, hey, there's resistance, there's this interesting cultural output, we should pay attention to it. That was in 1966. No one paid much attention to him until after the 67 war. After the 67 war, Arab intellectuals started to pay much closer attention to what was happening in Israel. partly to figure out how, and they possibly lost, against Israel in 6 days in the June 67 war, but also as part of a larger self-evaluation, and also as part of a larger movement towards a more radical shift in Arab cultural production, Arab cultural appraisal, and so forth. And it is in that context that they discovered, I would argue, or rediscovered perhaps, the Palestinian intellectuals in Israel, particularly the poets, and most specifically the resistance poets Mahmoud Darwish over here and Samih al-Qasim on the other end. And so this picture, which is also from the cover of my book, is at the 1968 World Youth Festival in Sofia, Bulgaria. And this was the first time either of those two had left the country. And it was the first time that Palestinian citizens of Israel were really celebrated in the Arab world. Other Arab delegates, not in the Arab world, because they weren't allowed to go, but by Arab intellectuals who had also gone to Sofia as part of this festival. This is a quadrennial festival every 4 years that brought in thousands and thousands of delegates from all over the world. About 500 delegates were at the 1968 conference, and they were very excited to meet Mahmoud Darwish and Samih al-Qasim. Darwish and Qasim were likewise very excited to meet with other Arab intellectuals. The man in the middle there is a very famous Iraqi poet of an earlier generation, Muhammad Mahdi al-Jawahiri, who, and so the story, as they later told it, was that Darwish and Qasim went to Jawahiri's hotel room to get a fan pic with him. So you see them standing very, proudly in their suits. They seem to have woken him up from his nap, so Jawahiri's not as excited to be taking a picture with them. But it's a very symbolic photo, and it's one that I wanted actually on the cover of my book for a very long time, and ended up being there, because it encapsulates many of the themes that I talked about. It's in some ways a culmination of the earlier strategies of resistance that they and their predecessors engaged with. It speaks to the transnational elements that I focus on in my book. It speaks to the central role of cultural production in my book as well. But it also, Jawahiri's kind of less than enthusiastic pose in that picture also speaks to the ongoing tensions and the ongoing suspicion that many Arab intellectuals continue to have about this group in